It's like follow the leader. Everybody does what the Hulkster does. It's like truth, justice, and the Hulk Hogan way.
Right.
And I hope today.
The shocking death of Hulk Hogan on July 24, 2025, shook the wrestling world to its core. Fans everywhere mourned the loss of a man who had defined an era, who had carried professional wrestling into the mainstream with his charisma, his energy, and his larger-than-life persona. For so long, Hogan was seen as indestructible, a man who could never truly fall. But behind the public tributes and the countless memories of yellow and red, there was another story unraveling, one that painted his death in an entirely different light. And this story didn't come from reporters or distant voices. It came from his own daughter, Brooke Hogan, who revealed documents and details so alarming that they have raised questions about whether Hulk Hogan's death was truly natural or the result of something far darker. Police were quick to release their initial findings. Hogan had gone into cardiac arrest at his home in Clearwater, Florida, and despite being transported to Morton Plant Hospital, he was pronounced dead at 11:17 a.m. The report was clear. No signs of foul play.
When I saw him, he was no-selling it and pushing his beer.
No suspicious activity, just the tragic end of a man whose body had endured decades of punishment. But Brooke Hogan wasn't convinced. In fact, she began leaking documents that suggested a cover-up, evidence that pointed toward negligence, corporate greed, and possibly even intent. For Brooke, the idea that her father's death was just another tragic medical case wasn't enough. She believed something much bigger was at play, and the proof she brought forward left fans stunned. What Brooke revealed centered on an explosive $50 million lawsuit that Hulk Hogan himself had filed years earlier. This wasn't a rumor or speculation. These were legal documents, court filings that described in excruciating detail how her father had been systematically broken down by a medical system that failed him. In his later years, Hulk Hogan had become almost unrecognizable compared to the immortal figure fans remembered. Once billed at 6'7", he had lost nearly 3 inches in height due to spinal compression. His bronzed tan had faded. His 24-inch pythons, once the stuff of legend, had withered. But more than that, his strength, his movement, his health, all had been compromised by a series of medical procedures that Brooke now argued should never have been performed in the first place. Hogan himself had spoken about it. In one of his final interviews, he admitted how much pain he was in. He described how even the simplest daily activities had become a struggle. Something as routine as brushing his teeth was nearly impossible because he couldn't push himself off the counter afterward. This wasn't the Hulkster fans thought they knew. This was a man tortured by pain, betrayed by the very doctors who were supposed to heal him. Over the course of just a decade, he underwent a staggering 25 surgeries. 10 of those were specifically on his back, each one leaving more scars, more damage, more despair. And as Brooke's documents showed, many of those surgeries may never have been necessary at all. The most damning revelations came from his $50 million lawsuit against the Laser Spine Institute. According to that suit, between 2009 and 2010, Hogan underwent 6 separate procedures for spinal conditions that, medical experts would later argue, could have been treated differently. The lawsuit claimed these weren't just ineffective, they were deliberately unnecessary, performed because the institute allegedly prioritized profit over patient care. The documents revealed that the doctors had used scare tactics to steer Hogan away from traditional spinal fusion surgery, which might have given him lasting relief. Instead, they sold him on their own methods, less invasive procedures that promised quick recovery, but in truth destabilized his already fragile back. The consequences were devastating. Instead of relief, Hogan's back grew worse, leaving him writhing in pain and robbed of his ability to perform the way he once had. More heartbreaking still, these failed procedures cost him the one final match he had always dreamed of: a WrestleMania showdown against John Cena. Fans had waited years to see the torch passed from one era's icon to the next, but because of botched medical treatments, that match never happened. Hogan himself admitted that the dream was gone. His body was simply too broken. And if the lawsuit was accurate, that loss wasn't the result of natural wear and tear. It was the result of conscious decisions made by a medical institute driven by financial gain. Founder James St. Louis allegedly had ownership interests that weren't disclosed to Hogan, suggesting conflicts of interest that made every procedure not about health, but about profit. Insurance companies were billed hundreds of thousands of dollars. Hogan, meanwhile, found himself trapped in a cycle of surgeries, each one offering only temporary relief before leaving him worse than before. The pain, the lost career opportunities, the physical destruction of his body, all of it led him to estimate damages of more than $50 million. Eventually, the case was settled out of court, reportedly for a massive sum, but no amount of money could undo the damage. By the time Hogan underwent traditional spinal fusion surgery, it was too late. The chance for his dream farewell match had passed. His health had been permanently compromised. Brooke Hogan would later point to this moment as the beginning of her father's downfall, not just physically, but emotionally. He had been manipulated, deceived, and discarded, and it broke more than just his body. It broke his spirit. But Brooke's revelations didn't stop there. She insisted that the malpractice went far beyond surgeries. Hogan had also been overprescribed dangerous drugs in a way that nearly killed him years before his actual death. Chief among them was fentanyl, one of the deadliest opioids on the market. Hogan himself admitted that he didn't even realize he had been given it until he nearly overdosed. The doses were so high that pharmacists were shocked he was still alive. The patches, the pills, the sheer volume of the drug coursing through his system. It was a cocktail that could have ended his life long before July 2025. For Brooke, this wasn't a coincidence. This was a system designed to exploit her father, to keep him in pain, to keep him dependent, and to keep billing his insurance for as long as possible. When she revealed these documents, she wasn't just airing family grievances. She was suggesting something far more chilling, that the medical system that was supposed to save her father might have been the very system that destroyed him. And with that revelation came a haunting question. Was Hulk Hogan's death the result of natural decline, or had he been pushed toward the grave by a combination of negligence, greed, and cover-ups? Brooke believed the answer was clear. And as the world began to examine her claims, the story of Hogan's tragic final years began to look less like the natural end of a legend and more like a scandal waiting to be fully uncovered. As Brooke continued releasing her revelations, the narrative around Hulk Hogan's death became darker and more unsettling. It wasn't just about bad surgeries or a series of botched medical choices anymore. It was about betrayal at every level. About people who claimed to love him profiting from his pain while hiding the truth from the public. For Nick Hogan, who stood beside his father during those brutal last years, and for Brooke, who now chose to bring these truths into the light, the reality was almost too much to bear. The world remembered Hogan as a warrior who told kids to say their prayers and take their vitamins. But behind closed doors, the Hulkster was surrounded by manipulation, silence, and ultimately a system that drained the very life from him. In her documents, Brooke didn't stop at the malpractice suits or the drugs. She detailed how her father's so-called inner circle shielded the public from the truth, even as his body failed him completely. as Hogan's spine collapsed and his breathing became labored. Those closest to him told the world he was doing phenomenal. They painted pictures of karaoke nights, of strong recovery, of a man who could still stand tall. But Brooks' leaks suggested that these reassurances weren't optimism. They were deception. The image of Hulk Hogan, the brand, was being guarded at the cost of Terry Bollea, the man. And that deception, she argued, robbed him of dignity in his final days. Fans never got the chance to say goodbye, and Hogan never got the honesty he deserved. The estrangement within the Hogan family only added to the tragedy. Brooke had cut off her father years before, citing abuse and manipulation, but as she came forward with these revelations, her words carried an almost haunting duality. On the one hand, she exposed the corporate and medical betrayals that brought her father to the brink. On the other, she admitted in a chilling confession that by staying away, by refusing contact, and by fighting him through years of bitterness, she had indirectly contributed to the loneliness that consumed him in his final hours. Her estrangement, her silence, and her bitterness all played a part in the web that surrounded him. She revealed that she had supported lawsuits and actions that, in her words, paid for the very system that killed him. It wasn't a confession of pulling a trigger. It was something far more devastating, a recognition that in the chaos of lawsuits, estrangement, and money, she had been a piece of the machinery that wore him down until there was nothing left. Her brother Nick's testimony only made the picture more damning. He had witnessed firsthand the decline his father suffered after major spinal surgery in May 2025. Feeding tubes, breathing struggles, vocal cord damage, none of it was made public. Instead, friends like Jimmy Hart and Eric Bischoff kept up the illusion of health. Brooke now claimed these weren't misguided attempts to protect Hogan's privacy, but active measures to protect business interests tied to his name. As long as the public believed Hogan was strong, the brand stayed profitable. And as long as the truth was hidden, Hogan's suffering was ignored. The final revelation came with Hogan's official death report: renal failure, fluid overload, severe COPD, cardiac arrest, all conditions that had been carefully hidden, all realities that could have been confronted sooner if honesty had prevailed. Instead, Hogan's decline was packaged behind smoke and mirrors until the inevitable end came crashing down. Brooks' leaks painted this not as natural tragedy, but as murder by 1,000 cuts. Each surgery, each prescription, each deception pushing him closer to the grave. What shocked fans the most wasn't just the idea that Hogan's death had been preventable. It was that Brooke herself admitted she carried guilt for being part of the machine. In her own words, she said she had paid into the very system that ended my father's life. It was a stunning confession, one that blurred the lines between victim and participant. Was she exposing the truth as a grieving daughter? Or was she trying to wash her hands of guilt by dragging everyone else into the spotlight? That question continues to haunt those who followed her revelations. Yet, despite the bitterness, the betrayals, and the shocking documents, the world still remembered Hulk Hogan as larger than life. Tributes poured in from legends, celebrities, politicians, and fans who had grown up watching him slam giants and preach loyalty, prayers, and vitamins. But as the applause echoed and memorials were made, Brooks' words hung over the legacy like a storm cloud. What if the hero millions adored had been destroyed not by time, but by greed? What if his end wasn't the natural conclusion of a wrestling career, but the result of betrayal from within? For fans, it's an unbearable thought that the same man who taught generations to believe in strength, faith, and loyalty may have been robbed of his own by a system that viewed him as nothing more than a brand to exploit. For Brooke, it was the weight of knowing her father's death was not only tragic, but avoidable. And for Nick, it was the horror of watching truth buried under lies until the very end. The story of Hulk Hogan's death may never be untangled fully. What remains certain is that his legacy as an icon is forever stained by the betrayals he endured. Brooke Hogan's revelations may have opened a door that cannot be closed, leaving fans to grapple with the reality behind the hero they once adored. Hulk Hogan lived as a legend but died as a man, surrounded by silence, manipulation, and shadows. If you grew up watching Hulk Hogan, if you remember the music, the poses, the slams, and the energy, then you know his impact was bigger than life itself. But as these revelations continue to surface, fans are being asked to look deeper, to see the man behind the myth and question the cost of fame, loyalty, and trust. If you want to uncover more about the shocking betrayals, scandals, and hidden truths of wrestling's biggest legends, make sure you stay with us, subscribe, and don't miss what's coming next. Because as Brooke Hogan just revealed, sometimes the real story behind the ring is darker than anything that ever happened inside it.